This podcast is brought to you by Burl Audio. Get it right the first time. Learn more at burlaudio.com.
Hey, it's Larry Crane. Welcome to the Tape Op Podcast. For this episode, we have something different for you. This is a roundtable discussion with Tony Visconti, Chris Kimsey, Martin Terefe, George Murphy, and Andy Cook, recorded in England at Kingston University's Visconti Studios. They discuss the recording and production practices that shaped the iconic records of the past, the abuse of tape, and the slow process of recording and editing analog media. Talking us through some of their experiences in the studio with David Bowie and the Rolling Stones, Tony and Chris reveal some of their own creative approaches to tape-based production. Enjoy!
My name is Isabella van Elferen. I work at Kingston University, where I'm the director of the Visconti Studio, which is an analog and digital hybrid studio that we set up with Tony Visconti. And with me is my colleague Leah.
Hi, my name is Leah Kardos. I'm a researcher and a musician, and I work at Kingston University. And I'm interested in creativity in large format studios, including analog as well.
Hi, I'm Tony Visconti. And I'm a record producer for a very long time, recording engineer, musician, and I am very involved with the Visconti studio in Kingston University. But anyway, that's me. That's who I am.
Hi, my name is Chris Kimsey. I'm a record producer, recording engineer, and 40 years of recording and producing incredible music. I started at Olympic Studios in London, and I'm actually back there now, resurrecting and building a new studio. And it was Tony that introduced me to Kingston. The facility there is excellent. And we had a wonderful week of recording 24-track analog, which was a mind blower for the students and for myself, because I hadn't recorded on analog for maybe a couple of years. So it was wonderful to get back to it. Looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts about.
Hi, I'm Andy Cook. I'm a recording engineer based out of a studio in London called British Grove. I've been recording for about 15 years in all kinds of methods and facilities, recording in sheds and warehouses and live gigs to high-end recording studios.
My name is Martin Terefe, and I'm a songwriter and record producer and musician. I've been making records for quite a long time as well. I started in the late 80s when really the kind of, just in the beginning when digital was appearing in various incarnations in recording. But I started analog and have gone through that whole transition. And I also own two studios here, Eastcote and Castletown. We're in Eastcote right now, and I've also just become a partner in an amazing studio in Stockholm called Atlantis, which was the old Metronome Studios, which is really exciting. So, and I have a small studio in New York. So I do a lot of recording, and I do use analogs still.
My name's George Murphy. I am a sound engineer and producer based at the wonderful Eastcote Studios in London, where I'm currently the head engineer for this wonderful place that allows me to spend lots of time playing with old analog gear and lots of new fancy digital gear as well. I've been based here for about 8 years ago when I started here as an assistant, and it's been a great 8 years.
Great.
Brilliant.
So we wanted first to talk a little bit about the secrets of analog and why it is so different than digital. So Leah, would you like to offer some questions?
Yes. So my first question is about analog being an iconic type of presence in the studio. Sort of in popular culture, for better or worse, we associate it, analog processes and analog equipment, with the prestige and the iconic sounds of the past, particularly that rich period during the late 60s, early to mid 70s, when technology and experimentation were driving production aesthetics in really fun directions. My first question is really like, is it true? Does analog give people a way to accessing that iconic sound? Is analog equipment or processes or the medium itself part of the quote-unquote secret? Or can digital do it all these days?
You know, I started analog recording in 1967 and spent a good sort of 10 years before I saw the first piece of digital equipment, which was the Eventide Harmonizer 910. So I worked with analog daily. I owned a recording studio. I had two 24-track machines in tandem. And anytime I had a hit record, I just threw the money back into buying more equipment, because otherwise I'd pay a lot of income tax. So my equipment just grew and was literally spilling out of the doors of the studio, going into the back room. And when we needed it, it came back in. So the analog chain is not only the tape, obviously. The tape is the last end of the chain. It begins with a super great microphone, and condenser mics were always the rule of the day. And then, of course, we have our favorite ribbons and all that. But the list is very long. If you want secrets, each and every one of us has our own preferences and our own secrets. Some microphones, other people say are wonderful, like the C12. I always hated it. So you're going to say you love it, and that's your secret, and that's my secret. But the part that I think we're going to really concentrate on is what tape does to the sound. Yeah, because we're still using the analog chain, the front end, but the back end now is digital in almost 99% of the world, studio world. So like tape is a charming thing. It's a beast. It needs taming. You have to start out from a good place where you work in a studio, such as the one that Andy works in, where you have daily maintenance on a tape machine and constant examining the heads, the circuitry, listen for, make sure there's no noise crept into each channel, each module. So if you love tape, you have to know this stuff to make the tape work for you. And once a tape machine is lined up in a pristine way, then you can proceed to abuse it. And it's the abuse that makes it sound wonderful. And that is basically saturation, saturating the tape. How much do you do that? To this day, there is no meter that tells you how much you are saturating the tape. You got to use this one and this one. Well, this one's better for me. But you have to use these to tell you what the saturation is and how much of it you want. And how, you have to know things like on 16-track, your kick drum plays back at the same volume that you recorded it at. But on 24-track, it doesn't. It comes back like a wee little sound, Another secret of mine is I recorded the kick drum on 2 tracks. And in the old days. And so we finally got some weight back, When I first got a 24-track machine, I loved the extra tracks because you could be more creative and you didn't have to bounce down as much. But the drums didn't sound as good as they did on 16-track, quite honestly. All these things are kind of arcane knowledge, and each of us here knows what that is, and, through experimentation. Digital is what goes in, comes out. It's not really difficult to understand how digital works. You don't have to know how it works, but people get instant gratification when they use digital these days.
Yeah.
You are not guaranteed instant gratification when you work on analog.
Yeah.
Yeah, I support all those things that Tony has said, obviously. I think there's a lot to learn from working with the whole analog chain, with signal-to-noise ratios, even within the console, mic pre's getting the right mic pre level, which when you get into digital, you don't have to worry about that so much. You can kind of fix it later. Well, I don't think you can fix it later, but it's not so imperative as it is in the analog world, where you really have to be on the ball and get everything set well in advance. Yeah, it's wonderful to have the tape compression. The thing is about analog and digital, it just makes up the sound. Analog is the purest form of reproduction, I feel, of sound in its inherent way of what it is, the magnetic tape.
Can you always hear that difference?
I can definitely hear a difference, or I feel a difference.
That's
if I'm
interesting.
working on something that's been recorded totally in digital, I get ear fatigue after about 3 hours, 4 hours. I have to step out. If I'm working on something that's been recorded on analog, even, strangely, even if it's been recorded on analog and then dumped into Pro Tools, I don't get that fatigue as much. And also EQing from a digital source as opposed to an analog source. EQing on a digital source, it can be quite ugly. It's sort of smooth. It's not as warm. Yeah, it's not as smooth as EQing something from an analog source where you could really screw the gain right up, and you'll more likely just get more noise, but you won't get a horrible digital crap out sound.
I just wanted to ask you both in response to that, these secrets of these, iconic sounds, were they born from necessity? Like, was it you guys pushing the technology beyond its limits in order to make it malfunction or to saturate or to see how it can go, and that bending of the technology? Because it strikes me that analog gives you a little bit more plasticity in that way. You can kind of push it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think there's secrets. It was just what we were choosing to, as Tony said, push the tape to the limit and see what would come back. And so all of a sudden we had another media that we could play with, apart from the microphones and the consoles and everything else. That our main recording source, or what it was going to end up on, was another media that you could shape and change things on. And then also Dolby was a great thing with tape as well. You could that was another great introduction, because tape was inherently noisy and it wasn't that much fun running at 30 IPS because you get through a reel of tape very quickly. So 15 IPS was my preferred speed, but with Dolby SR was one of the most beautiful sounds I've ever heard.
I agree that the thing we found out we could do with analog tape, which is, by the way, I forgot to include in my little speech there, that it sounds glorious. It's smoother. We know that digital is a series of zeros and ones, and analog is a smooth curve. And that smooth curve of sound is detectable by any ear, whether you're an engineer or a person who has a large record collection. People know the difference. And it's something like, if you have a great French meal, you don't know what the hell they put in the pepper and salt, how much they put in. It just tastes great, and that's what I akin analog is to digital. The other thing we learned from the Beatles right early on was you can get these strange sounds like phasing and flanging, and that, to my ears, I have never heard a digital equivalent to the way you can do that with analog tape, because with analog, when you do phasing, you actually, I won't go into the 3-machine setup, but once you get to when the two playheads start to hit each other, you get that sound where you're going into outer space or you're being sucked into a jet plane. And you can go right beyond that. You can actually go into the future, which you can't do in digital. You go, where's we're listening now, then you hit that point and then suddenly, so this thing, I have never heard a box that does it that well, that we did it when you had like 3 people had to be holding a knob and like listening in the studio while you were doing these phasing and flanging effects. And there were more than one way to do it. Like you did it differently with a Studer machine than you did it with an MCI machine, because Studer, you could play back the record head and you could play back the playback head at the same time, which was...
And it was never the same twice, was it?
It was fantastic, but it was just fantastic. We can't do that. Like digitally, you have some amazing special effects, but the analog sound and the way we did it in the analog way, if you hear Strawberry Fields Forever or Ichiku Park, I have not heard phasing or flanging that good ever since. I mean, unless you do it on tape.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like, a part of that is like, it's the kind of 100% predictability of digital, which, like, if you record on a tape, and I remember, I traveled quite a lot and kind of mixed often in New York, and you have to kind of take the tape with you, and it will be played back on a different machine than the one you kind of recorded on, and it will always sound, you never knew exactly how it was going to sound, and that led to reacting in the studio to the new setup. There's a new console, the new tape machine. Maybe it was a good alignment, maybe it wasn't, maybe you were in a hurry, maybe you weren't, and kind of and in all that kind of uncertainty, like mistakes happened that sometimes became, beautiful, glorious experiments that kind of you could never recreate, and that never really happens in digital, because obviously kind of you set your settings and then you do it and then it will come back, exactly the way you did it, and I think that's kind of a difference as well.
Personally, what I've always found with analog, and going into what you're saying about pure aesthetics of the sound, people always need to remember, like, having a tape machine and being in a studio with a tape machine, it's not going to make you sound like the Rolling Stones. You need to be the Rolling Stones, and you need people like Chris and Tony who knew how to abuse and get these effects and these sounds, maybe through accidents or pre-planned experiments. I know where I work at British Grove, it's a bit of a playground for legendary gear. But, all this gear does is it's just a magnifying glass. If you sound bad at home, it's going to make it very much apparent that you sound bad in this recording studio. And that's any medium. That's any medium.
It's part of the cell, isn't it? It's like, with these plugins now that are emulating analog, they're kind of selling this promise of, like, you in your home studio with your cheap microphone, if you use our UAD Luna DAW, you're going to sound like Amy Winehouse on Back to Black or something. So they are kind of selling this old way of doing things and setting up this idea that the old way is the best way and it's the authentic way. When really it's about knowledge, right? It's about knowing how to drive the equipment.
And it's analog tape as well.
Yeah, it's the actual material.
The thing about recording with analog is when you listen back to your take, you're just in amazement of what you've captured. Because, well, first of all, you have to wait for the tape to rewind. So there's at least a 4-minute blast before you hear it again. But when you do hear that take, you're in another world. In digital, you're in the same world all the time. And I think your brain doesn't have time to separate from the performance to what you're listening. And when you listen back to digital, it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, that's all right. But tape, it's like, wow. It kind of magnifies the feeling that you've captured on tape somehow. Which I think the fact that happens is that the way we feel and listen to music is not ones and zeros. It's waveform, and magnetic tape is a lot softer in collecting that and documenting that than digital.
Well, I made a lovely album with Andy, and we recorded it, the backing tracks on analog. And it was a treat for the whole band. And what Chris just said about the rewind, it's an agonizingly long wait for people who are used to digital. My God, it's a whole 30 seconds before you can hear the playback. But what I loved is, like, with analog tape, by the time you did rewind it, it would give the band time to walk into the room. And so they didn't really have to wait. By the time they made it into the control room or went to the loo or something, like, you were ready to play back that take, which gave you time to think, time to, like Chris said, time to, like, ruminate about it and hear the difference. Like, when you're a guitar player or a bass player and you're wearing headphones, you're just listening to the drum kit and all that, and everyone comes in and hears what everyone else has been contributing to it, which is quite a wonderful experience. And it's more amplified with analog recording when you have that. It's more communal, and of course it's smoother. Like, we all grew up listening to analog recordings, and we have it in our DNA, how nice and smooth that all sounds, By the way, Chris made a point. I would just like to say his preference is 15.
Yeah.
That's my preference. That's my preference, too, because when you record at 30 is so clean. It sounds a little digital. I cannot saturate tape at 30 IPS. It only seems to happen at 15 for me. I can hear it at 15.
Yeah, the bass is better at 15.
The bass is better, exactly. You get a little bump there and all that. And so these are things you learn, as Leah raised, over experimentation over the years. Because, like, when 30 came in, everyone's recording at 30, and I go, yeah, 30. And maybe, if the highs are a little bit better. It really didn't add to the recording. It didn't add much. And it's better you get a multi-track tape. You'll get 6 takes of the song on it easily. You might squeeze a 7th. 30 IPS, 3 takes, And you can't really stack, which I've done many an album where you had a stack to the ceiling of 30 IPS tapes, like 14, 15, 16 tapes for the whole album, which was a 40-minute album.
I was actually going to pick up on that, Tony, the space that analog creates in the studio, because I noticed that with those sessions, Chris, how much time was injected into the day, because we were changing reels, we were stopping for edits, we were rewinding the tape. But there was a lot of kind of sitting down and chilling out, and it felt like there was room to breathe and be creative and talk about the music and not get tired. It wasn't exhausting, even though we were working all day until late at night. It felt manageable.
Well, we were working all day and all night, but the musicians weren't working.
That's true.
That's the good thing, I think, for the musicians is that, they're not, in the digital world, it's like, okay, next take, do it again. And it goes on and on like that. But in the analog world, as Tony said, there's time to reflect and there's time to think and listen. When you record on analog, you're listening to the music with your ears. You're not looking at a screen and looking at waveform. Because people are not really, they think they're listening, but they're not. They're looking at a waveform and thinking about, is that in sync with that? Yeah.
I think that goes all the way to the mix stage, actually, because I've noticed one thing that's changed for me as a producer a lot is that I don't go to mixes anymore. I've totally lost interest in it, because before you'd go to mix with someone that was generally better at mixing than you were yourself, so you go and mix with, Michael Brower or someone, and then you put the tape on, and first of all, like the whole waiting whilst you're rewinding means like when you mix analog, you rarely loop things or kind of focus in on only one little 10-second segment. You kind of rewind the tape and then you listen to the song again. And then you try to remember all the little things you wanted to adjust that first time you heard it. And by the time you listen to it 6 or 7 times, you kind of forgotten the things that weren't that important. And you kind of and you fixed or made good everything that really was important. And there's always that dialogue when you rewind the tape. I try to tell the mix engineer everything I want him to kind of focus on the next pass. And with digital, you're in a room with someone and they're totally in their world, just much like, like you're in your own world on the phone nowadays, It's like, and you generally kind of, you mix in sections. So now we're going to mix the chorus and it's on loop and it goes around, the music never stops, and kind of, it's exhausting. So so if I use other people to mix now, I generally prefer sending it, getting it back, being able to listen to it in my own time, and then kind of compiling my list of comments and sending them back. It's a different process than it used to be when it was actually kind of, the mix was also kind of an event. Now the event for me is the actual making of the record, and then the mix is somewhat kind of become akin to mastering back in the day or something. It's like
that's so interesting.
That's changed for me.
There's also, I don't have experience like you guys to draw from, but we did teach analog for the first time at Kingston this last year. And one thing that was really apparent was that these students, who are all digital natives, for want of a better term, were not prepared for being rehearsed in the studio. They didn't know their stuff, and they sort of thought that they could just bring their band to the studio and just see what happens and write the song in the studio. And of course, it doesn't work that way. And I think it was a big shock for them to realize that at least if you're going to be jamming, you've got to be tight, because you can't edit something that's not tight. And if you haven't rehearsed this prog rock masterpiece that you're working on and you can't play it from beginning to end, get used to punching in. And there's this whole kind of vocabulary and way of thinking about their own musicianship was transformative for them because of the medium, because it forced them to work a certain way. I would argue maybe even a more musical way. It asked them to be better musicians.
Young musicians and analog and digital, a young band coming into the studio, the first thing they'll probably ask you is, have you got a click track?
You had to record the click track.
We had click tracks. I actually remember that transition. For a moment, you didn't always have click tracks. And then all of a sudden, I think that was the first kind of major that I can remember since I started recording, that it totally changed everything, because when people started to record to click, and then combined with kind of syncing up 2 machines in the 80s, like early 90s, when I really kind of started making records and stuff, then, I remember some producers would be kind of comparing, the drummer's bass drum with the click, and if anything flanged a little bit, they'd be kind of like, back, kind of, do another overdub, and
Early dance music made us, the demands to play to a click were dictated by people had to be like dance and tempo and all that. And there were amazing drummers, like Chris said, who could actually hold a tempo for 5 minutes. Dennis Davis, who worked with David Bowie, was like that. His timekeeping was impeccable. But later with disco music, drummers had to start playing to click tracks, which you had to record on tape. And
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
yeah, like you just got to metronome something. I mean, there was no like zero, there was no markers like there are in the digital world. But then records just had to be tighter than ever, The drums and bass had to be locked in rather.
My reference there was going to be working on so many Stones albums. The first one that I recorded, engineered completely was Some Girls. The Rolling Stones have never used the click track.
No.
You don't need it with Charlie. The title track, Some Girls, was actually, it was pretty much, I think, 1 or 2 takes, but it was 17 minutes long because Mick had so many verses about so many different girls. The bridge only came up twice in the whole recording. And after 17 minutes of it, we listened back to it, and Mick said to me, he said, great, okay, edit it down to, like 4.5 minutes. So I said, well, what verses do you want? He said, I don't care, you choose. So there I was editing the 16-track tape, and I was absolutely amazed that I could take a verse from like 8 minutes, put it into 2 minutes. I could move verses around to where I wanted to from this 17-minute performance, and the tempo was solid all the way. The situation, recording with drummers who weren't playing with clicks, then the drummer would start playing, his dynamic would change. He was kind of fighting against the click with his dynamic, and I would try to avoid clicks as much as possible. But Tony's completely right. When the whole dance thing came on board, it had to be at the perfect BPM. It didn't wander. And that filtered through into mainstream recording.
Yeah.
I have a question for you guys, Tony and Chris, because what I felt with click was that, once everyone was recording to click, because it was always like, when I started recording, it was always a question, should we have click or shouldn't we have click? And everyone knew that it was going to be a vibier take if you used click, but or if you didn't use click, but then if you used click, then you had more options to do things. And I feel like not only were the drummers capable of playing without click and tight and all that, but also there was, it was part of the musical language. Tracks did speed up, and they could kind of have a bit of a lighter tempo in the verses and so on. And that was kind of an extra color in music. Once most music was made to click, it kind of has slowly disappeared. I mean, now, like, if you hear something that's not like a dead tight tempo now, quite often you feel like that's untight. Whereas before, if you heard Bernard Purdie and James Jamerson and they played, tempo went a little bit up and down, it was like, it was more flavor. And I feel the same happened when autotune eventually came in. In the beginning, autotune was a flavor that sounded, and you could immediately hear it. Now it's hard to hear any modern music where the vocal isn't so incredibly hard tuned that, like, as soon as you hear someone that just sounds a little bit bluesy or works totally within the realm of what back 20 years ago would be, not only kind of accepted, but kind of maybe used as a tool for an amazing blues singer, now doesn't really exist anymore. It's just been, like the ears have been tuned to a different aesthetic altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah, some engineers or producers would even auto-tune the blue note that a singer, that's what they want. They want that note. And then a mix comes back and you go, wait, what's happened to my ear? And it's been straightened out. Yeah. It's been perfect, yeah.
Can I just say one thing about the click? And when I started to use it early in the game, like in the late 70s, maybe I started using clicks, I noticed that, like, in a rock track, it kills the groove. And everyone called
Yeah.
it, oh, you're going to use a click? That's the groove. They even called it the groove killer, the click. So I did two things. Some drummers were great, but they don't have that, rock steady tempo. But they are great anyway. They're the more flamboyant ones. They get excited and they play a fill and they go into the chorus really early. If you analyze it digitally, you go, oh, that's too early. I would start the click from the intro to the end of the first verse, turn the click off, and they would be free. After they really heard the click in their heads in other words, for about the first minute and a half of the song, then I'd cut it and then they'd do free form for the rest of it. And that often saved a lot of trouble. Like with a group, the drummer would count off and then 10 seconds later they're playing faster, So let's decide what the friggin' tempo is and then
Yeah.
play to it for a minute and a half. The other thing I did was I analyzed that a chorus might be 1 BPM faster than a verse. So I actually programmed clicks sometimes. And I would do the bar before the chorus, I would do a gradual tempo increase. So even when the drummer was playing to the click, I kind of analyzed what the feel of a drummer would be. I anticipated what the feel of a drummer would be. And then also getting back into the next verse, I would program the BPM to go down 1 BPM or maybe a little more to go back into the verse and sit there. And it's only through years of organic recording that I understand the process of how drummers think and how musicians feel. This applies mainly to a rock track. So you can even be creative, very, very creative with a click. It could be a groove killer, but if you use it in the right way, it could make the song sparkle.
Yeah.
I think just an interesting point. The great thing about, going against the grain here, but with digital recording, you're not always locked into that grid. As Tony was saying, he would ride a click. But what you could have now is you could have a drummer who's got great feel and great groove, you get a great drum take, and then tempo map his performance. And then if you've got sequence elements, that are being generated by MIDI or whatever, they can breathe and move with the track.
Thanks for listening. To check out this conversation in its entirety, please go to www.visconti-studio.co.uk/research. Be sure to keep up with all things Tape Op on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time.